Hello, my name's Jacob Glazner, and this is my presentation on the mother's trip. Very important is we are doing a flight from New England to the Midwest. I picked Wyoming. Wyoming had a little bit of terrain obstacles, which we'll get into further in the presentation. But I picked Wyoming, that's where mom lives. For the pre-flight planning, the flight plan, I always make sure that I have a thorough flight plan done prior to flight following or IFR flight plan. I always make sure that I physically have a copy of the flight plan for myself so that I can know all the obstacles, anything that's going to be along the flight, I have marked down on my flight plan so that I can know different visual obstacles, different rivers or something that I can visually see within the aircraft and know where I am along the route. Second, we're going to talk about the PAVE checklist, which pilot, aircraft environment, external pressures. For the pilot, you want to make sure you go through the I'm safe checklist, illnesses, medication, alcohol, external pressures. Just go through your I'm safe checklist to make sure that the pilot is 100% for the flight. If you're maybe a little ill, then postpone the flight until you start feeling better. The aircraft, you want to make sure that the maintenance logs are all correct and true. Make sure that all of the logs are there, that you see the physical copy, and make sure that the aircraft is airworthy to fly. You also need to check the airworthiness for the aircraft, make sure that the registration's on the inside of the aircraft, and just make sure that the aircraft is safe to fly. Next would be the environment in the PAVE checklist. Make sure that there's no weather in the way. We're fortunately going to be able to fly from New England to Wyoming in VFR conditions, so we're not going to be going to any clouds, not going into any storms. It's just going to be a very safe VFR flight all the way to Wyoming. External pressures, we'll say that we're leaving 2 days early for this trip, so that gives us a 2-day gap to get to Wyoming. So in case we do come into unforeseeable weather, we'll be able to land an alternative along the route and camp out there for a day, and then once the weather gets better, continue our flight so that there are no external pressures towards the flight saying, hey, we have to get there at this time. Always plan ahead just in case there is something that pops up. So the aircraft pre-flight, you got to make sure that the documentation is present in the aircraft, make sure that the airworthiness is there, registration, make sure that all documentation is within the aircraft before getting into the plane, let alone flying it. Make sure that you go through an exterior check for the pre-flight. I like to go do a walk around first, make sure all my lights are working properly, and then hit the flaps down, make sure that the flaps are there, making sure that those are good, and then going around looking for any dinks or any scratches that weren't there before so that I know what is on the exterior of the aircraft. Make sure that all different doors of the aircraft are locked. If there's a compartment door, make sure that that's locked. Make sure that everything's secure before starting up the aircraft. Then you want to get into the interior, make sure that all your gauges are working, making sure that all of your interior gadgets are working and are true before going on a 2-hour flight. Whenever you got to make sure that your instruments are working properly. And then at the very end of my check, I like to go through the fluid check, make sure that there's gas in the aircraft for a long cross country, make sure that's topped off, make sure that you're within the weight requirements for that aircraft, and just make sure that your oil's good, hydraulic fluid if you need to check that. Make sure that everything's good before even starting up the aircraft and getting on your flight. Now, I always plan alternatives along the route. I like to put mine about 50 miles apart, anything that I can land at legally. 50 miles apart, I like to do 50 miles just in case, because anything can happen while in the aircraft, so I like to do mine about 50 miles apart. If there's a structure that can be seen from the air at 8,000 feet, 10,000 feet, then that structure is going to be a point along my route so that I can visually see it, be like, okay, I'm 7 miles away from this airport from that point. So I always like to plan ahead and make sure that I can go anywhere along the flight. I can always deviate to a specific airport and make sure that I can land safely. And then no matter the distance, so whether it's a 300-mile flight or whether it's a 50-mile flight, always have an alternative because anything can happen in the air. Since we are going to Wyoming, we are going to have a mountain range near the back half of the flight, so always make sure that you have your altitudes along the route. Make sure that you have plenty of terrain avoidance while carrying out this flight, and especially if you're landing next to a mountain range, you have to know the altitudes of that mountain range so that you know what your environment's going to be at that airport that you're landing at. So final thoughts on this is that you need to do a very thorough aircraft pre-flight. Make sure that everything's good on the aircraft before you even go on across the country, let alone starting up the aircraft. You have to make sure that the aircraft is 100%. I mean, even for doing landings in the traffic pattern, you have to make sure that the aircraft is 100%. Make sure that you have a thorough route/weather planning or briefing. Make sure you look at the weather. Make sure you know everything that's going to be going on to the hour, to the minute for that flight and what to expect. And then always have a backup plan, whether it's a 300, 500 nautical mile flight or whether it is a 50 nautical mile flight. You always have to have a backup plan for any flight that you conduct, and you have to make sure that you operate that aircraft as safely as possible and always have a backup for that flight. Thank you very much.